Alright friends, welcome to another New World video. In today's video we will be talking about the Void Gauntlet, which is a new weapon coming out in update 1.0.6, which is currently on the public test realm that just got released recently. This is a in-progress build, so it's still likely to change before things make it to live, but from what we've been able to see, the Void Gauntlet functions very well as a melee alternative to magic weapons, and has a lot of self-sustain if you're running solo, and like really good damage. And it seems like it can function very well in group play as a support weapon when you're, like, say when your life staff cooldowns are all running. It has a lot of options for supporting teammates in those times. Though we didn't really get to test out with any group stuff. So yeah, let's talk in this video about how I enjoyed playing the Void Gauntlet as a melee soloing kind of damage weapon. And we'll make a separate video for running the Gauntlet as a support. I'll put the link to that in the description if you are looking for that kind of build. But we'll start by going over all of the abilities that are here, and then we'll get down into the nitty gritty of the passives and everything. So on the Annihilation Tree, which is the damage side of things, we have the Void Blade, which is like the bread and butter. I feel like it's going to be really hard to play this thing as damage without the Void Blade. This is honestly so good. Summon a blade of void energy that converts your basic attacks to melee. Tap basic attack to perform a quick slash that deals 100% weapon damage, or hold to perform a thrust attack that deals 150% weapon damage. Both attacks inflict disintegrate on successful hits, dealing 5% weapon damage per second and reducing damage absorption by 5% for 8 seconds. Stacks up to 3 times 15-second duration for the blade itself. So the disintegrate debuff lasts for 8 seconds, and the sword itself can only be pulled out for 15 seconds at a time with a 24-second cooldown. So it's somewhere around like 60% uptime by default, but the passives give you a lot of options for reducing that cooldown, so you can have 100% uptime, with the only real downtime being however long it takes to recast the ability. Before we get too much more into abilities, we should also talk about the attacks, like just normally. It has just a normal range light attack and heavy. It's got about the same range as the life staff, so you can't like snipe stuff too well with it. But instead of blocking like the Ice Gauntlet can, you actually start getting attacked by your own gauntlet, and it drains your life to give you mana back. And that damage taken and mana regained scales off of your weapon damage. So the stronger you get, the more you hurt yourself, but also the faster you get your mana back. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. That's something that's really hard to use when you're soloing. So that seems like a better option for support players with groups and backup and stuff like that. At least from what I've seen so far. So the rest of the abilities are Oblivion. Summon a circular rift of void energy at your feet that deals 30% weapon damage per second to enemies and grants some power to self and friendlies, increasing damage by 20% in a 5-meter radius for 6 seconds. So that is a lot of empower. The damage is kind of negligible. It's there, but it doesn't feel that effective. It stacks nicely with Disintegrate, but on its own, it's not really anything to write home about. The big deal is Empower, and you can actually take a passive here to make that inflict weaken as well, up to 15% when it stacks up 3 times. So it's useful. It's more of a support ability on the damage tree. When running this as a damage weapon, I didn't really like it. I kind of preferred Baleful Tether, but we'll talk about that when we get to that side. So the last ability on Annihilation Tree, probably my favorite ability, is Petrifying Scream. Unleash a void-infused scream, dealing 100% weapon damage, staggering and inflicting root to enemies 5 meters in front of you. Disables enemy movement for 2 seconds. So None of the other abilities that I've read that I can think of on any weapon have ever said disables enemy movement. So what this means, or what this ends up doing, is anytime you see like the wolves pounce back and then like charge forward, or like those Angry Earth archers do their little, you know, like side dash, or like the jump backwards, and then their little barrage of arrows where they're always getting out of the way. This stops that entirely. I've had it interrupt grid attacks. I've had it, in some cases it seemed like it would stop enemies from turning, but that wasn't 100% consistent, so it may have just been something else. But what is consistent is this is a really nice ability. Damage is, you know, it's all right. It's a hit, but it's the big deal is staggering and disabling enemy movement, because you'll see enemies casting their abilities that normally move them, but they just don't go anywhere, and it's beautiful. I love it. So the abilities for Decay. Orb of Decay, fire an unblockable orb that passes through enemies and deals 100% weapon damage and inflicts disintegrate, dealing 5% weapon damage per second and reducing damage absorption by 5% for 8 seconds. Stacks up to 3 times at max range. It transforms into a healing orb and returns healing friendlies for 20% weapon damage per second for 5 seconds. And the healing scales exclusively with focus. So, the healing from Orb of Decay on its own, that 20% per second for 5 seconds, when you're running this as a solo damage weapon, that's really, it didn't feel noticeable to me at fighting the normal non-elite mobs in Shattered Mountain. There's a lot of footage of me trying out abilities in my VOD titled Void Gauntlet First Look on my channel. I'll put a link to that in the description as well, if you want to see the process of us figuring this all out. I couldn't really get into Orb of Decay. It seems like it would be really nice as like a little extra healing when you're running a life staff. All your abilities are out and you need just a little more. That's what this functions as, and the damage isn't nothing. Rending enemy damage absorption is good for all your teammates that are doing damage, so it's definitely a good support ability. Hard to notice in my experience for running solo. Baleful Tether, fire a projectile that tethers you to an enemy, weakening it and empowering you by 4% per second, up to 20%, so it takes 5 seconds to stack up. The tether ends if the target moves beyond 15 meters, with a 10-second duration. So you have 5 seconds of stacking in power, and then you have another 5 seconds at that full 20% duration, or 20% empower size scale, whatever you want to call it. Compare that to Oblivion over here, which is just a flat 20% empower for 6 seconds, and it doesn't weaken enemies by default. You do have to take a point into that if you are going to get that. So also, because this has a 15-meter range requirement, it's a lot easier to use that when you're playing melee than it is if you're like playing range and support and stuff. You have to be much more careful about your positioning when you're doing that. So I prefer to take this when playing solo, and I kind of prefer to take Oblivion when I'm playing support. But that's just my experience. Now the last ability is Essence Rupture. Fire a projectile that inflicts Essence Rupture for 10 seconds, healing anyone that hits the target for 20% of the damage done. Does not apply to damage over time. This tooltip doesn't say that it stacks with focus, but there is some kind of stacking in there. So because all of the other heals say they only stack with focus, I'd say it's safe to assume that this one does too. But basically I tried running a support Void Gauntlet with a Great Axe main weapon with intelligence attributes, focus secondary, and an intelligence gem in my axe. And when I was executing enemies, I was doing probably 3,600 damage while they were low health. And this was healing me for like 12 to 1,300 every time. So it's significant, it scales, it's good, but I never really tried it when trying to run solo, so maybe you could do that instead of Baleful Tether, but I really like the 20% empower. If you're trying to focus on damage, then that's really, really hard to pass up. But if you're having sustain issues, you could always try that and swap that in. So there's a lot of options for support, a lot of options for damage. The ones that I like to take are Void Blade. We're just gonna throw points into stuff, and then we'll talk about the things, the passives, after we break down the abilities themselves. So the way I like to play this is basically you just run up on enemies, whip out the sword, throw your tether, and just start going to town, dude. The attack speed's pretty quick. Even heavy attacks are pretty darn quick compared to other melee weapons, and you can get like leech on the heavy attack hit. When the void sword is out, you can block. It expired right when I started doing that, but we'll pull it out right about now. Can block as normal. You don't drain your health when you do this. You don't get mana back when you do this, but when you're in melee range, this is kind of a necessity. So this is the Scream. Interrupts things, knocks things back a little bit, stops them from moving. 15-second cooldown, really not bad. I'd say really, really good, actually. But the big thing we're seeing here is downtime for the sword. That 9 seconds is really, really, really annoying to deal with when you're trying to use Void Sword as like your main thing. So one of the things I prioritize most when picking passives is cooldown reduction. The most notable one being, there's two notable ones. It's Refreshing Frailty, 5% cooldown reduction on all abilities when successfully hitting enemies afflicted by 3 or more debuff stacks, can be from different debuffs. So Disintegrate, 3 stacks. Petrifying Scream, I think that puts a debuff on them. Either way, Baleful Tether definitely puts a debuff on them because it weakens them, and that stacks up as well. So yeah, there's good options there, and then cooldown reduction on all abilities on critical hit. So that's just another incentive to stack up crit, and with the attack speed of the Void Blade, that ends up, these will end up giving you near 100% uptime if you're constantly fighting. But before we get into the rest of the just small passives, let's talk about the ability upgrades that we can take. So the Void Blade can also gain Fortify on the start. 20% Fortify for 5 seconds when you hit the button, which is like a third of the duration, so it's pretty solid. 10% critical damage on Void Blade attacks. Just another reason to stack up that crit chance wherever you can. And successful thrust attacks heal for 5% weapon damage per disintegrate stacks, so that's up to 15%. And that healing scales with focus as well. Petrifying Scream can get a Bone Chilling Voice, which is root duration increased by 1 second on targets below 50% health. It's definitely noticeable because it's, I think, yeah, 2 second duration. Yeah, that's what it looks like. So increases that duration by 50% basically. Then Fortifying Echoes, fortify for each enemy hit, giving 10% damage reduction per stack up to 3 times for 10 seconds. So that's 30% for 10 seconds. This gives you 20% for 5 seconds. So by hitting those 2 buttons, boom, you're at 50% if you're fighting 3 enemies. You're at no less than 30% fortify for the next 5 seconds. Just from hitting your first 2 abilities. And then Baleful Tether over here has Tethered Refresh. Successful hits against the tethered target reduce other Void Gauntlet cooldowns by 5%. So you can't use this to get... this won't affect its own refresh, but between these 2 cooldown reduction passives, you end up having a pretty good uptime on Tether if you're constantly swinging. Which again, with the attack speed, you pretty much are. You can also get 100% mana regeneration while the tether is active, and a Soul Eater regain 80% weapon damage as health if the tethered target dies, scaling exclusively with focus. That one I had a hard time noticing. 80% sounds like a lot. in my testing with this, which is dodging with full mana heals you for 80% weapon damage. With 500 gear, with 500 gear score gear, that was about 600 healing when I tried that. So it's probably somewhere around that if you manage to kill what you're tethered to. It's not nothing, but it's not the craziest thing. So you might be able to skip that if you really wanted to. Just have a point for something else. So as far as other passives, we never went over the capstones. For the Decay Tree, they have Glimpse of the Void. Gain a stack of Void Essence per successful ability hit. At 4 or more stacks, your next successful ranged heavy attack will instantly reset all Void Gauntlet cooldowns and remove all stacks. It's a 15-second cooldown, and Orb of Decay is a 14.6-second cooldown. So basically, what you can do is if you're fighting, actually, come to think of it, I wonder if successful ability hit includes hitting allies with the healing orb on this. I never tested that, and that might be worth looking into. So that would work particularly well. If that's the case, then this would work really well in a group, because you can just throw the orb through your group and reset your cooldowns. And that way you have 2 rounds of spells per, naturally cooling down Orb of Decay. But I think this is pretty overshadowed, even if you're trying to play this as a support weapon. This is kind of overshadowed by Void Caller. On successful ability hit, gain a stack of Void Essence. At 6 stacks, consume all stacks and gain a 3-meter aura that heals self and friendlies for 30% weapon damage and deals 30% weapon damage per second to enemies within. Healing scales exclusively with focus, 5-second duration, 20-second cooldown. So it has a longer cooldown, but you heal all allies within the radius, you damage all enemies within the radius, and it doesn't sound like much, but when you're up at like 300 intelligence or focus, and then the rest are in the other stat, it ends up being pretty significant. And the sustain that you get out of this, especially when you're playing this as a solo. I know we keep going back and forth between talking about support and solo a little bit, but in particular when you're the main focus of enemy aggression, the sustain you get out of this is really good. The damage stacks up really nicely with the damage over time of Disintegrate. So you end up just constantly ticking enemies for damage all the time. And yeah, it's very, very good. That for solo, that is hands down the capstone to take. There's I think there's room for debate and a little more testing for support, but we'll talk about that more in the support video. For the rest of our passes, we'll go over the ones that we haven't taken. There's Forsaken Pact, 10% damage while below 50% mana. I wasn't really a big fan of that, just because I don't like trying to pay attention to how much mana I do have. And when you're wailing away in melee combat, you only have so much time to try and manage that kind of thing. It's one thing at range when you can cast abilities and then swap weapons and cast more abilities to go get that 50% threshold hit. And then you can mana drain if you're too low, but we've talked about your mana restore. But we've talked about you can't really use that essence drain when you're in melee combat, and if you change weapons while Void Blade is out, the Void Blade goes away and it's on full cooldown. So you're kind of screwed. You're committed when you hit the Void Blade button to keeping your Void Gauntlet out. So it's kind of hard to get value out of that on purpose while playing solo melee. Keen Confidence, 10% critical chance while above 50% health. With all the sustain we have, and the importance of being able to crit, I'd say this is a must take. Keen Humility, 10% critical chance while all abilities are on cooldown. Despite all the cooldown reduction we're taking, we like to constantly cast our abilities, so that is definitely worthwhile. Empowering Proximity, gain empower when casting abilities within 5 meters of an enemy, increasing damage by 10% for 5 seconds up to 3 times. So if you just yeet all your abilities like we kind of displayed in that little test run, right at the start of combat, you have 30% here, and then you're starting to stack up to this 20% here. And how long does this last? For 5 seconds. So by the time you hit 20% here, this will have expired, but basically you'll be over that 20%. Or you'll hit that 20% much faster while this is active, and then you take up to the 20th percent, and you basically go from 28 to 20 when that expires. But you know, it's just good. It's good. Efficient harvest essence health drain is reduced by 50% while below 25% mana. Again, really hard to use essence drain or harvest essence, whatever it's called, while you're doing it solo and you're getting hit by stuff already. You don't want to lose your own health. On critical hit, gain health equal to 15% of damage done with all the other crit stuff we're taking. That's the natural choice, and then Void Collar. This Leeching Agony, I'd say there is some room to change. Like if you find yourself at full mana often, then Mending Evasion could be worthwhile. But I think that's really meant to be like a recovery from after you're done using Harvest Essence. So there's some option for there. If you really feel like you're sustaining enough, then you could take Forsaken Pact. Since we are taking cooldown reduction and constantly trying to cast our spells all the time, then, you know, there's a good chance we'll be below 50% mana. So it's a valid option. It's basically, do you want a little more sustain or do you want a little more damage? As far as taking the first point in the Decay Tree, you either have Deadly Range, which is 10% damage on successful range heavy attacks against targets more than 8 meters away. We don't really use that too much. You get like one hit and then the enemy's running at you, and then you have to pull out your Void Blade, and then there's nothing else. So we also have Fervent Thirst, 5% mana per successful range light attack against targets afflicted by your Void Gauntlet debuffs. So again, this is also based on a range attack. I know we're talking about all mana. They're all melee support, melee solo, you know, big damage kind of thing. But the one thing that can happen is if you don't successfully reset the cooldown of Void Blade while you are using it, all you have is your range attack. So if you have used the Void Blade in combat, chances are enemies already have a debuff. So if it like just expires and then you start range attacking, you're gonna start getting mana back immediately. And if you can't use Harvest Essence because everything's in melee range, then this is like kind of becomes the one way to force yourself to get mana back outside of potions or food or anything like that. So it's just like a marginal kind of help that is more useful in edge situations, in my opinion, than Deadly Range. So we take Fervent Thirst, and I think that's pretty much the build. Again, Oblivion's like, if you really don't like Baleful Tether, then Oblivion's a good solid 20% in power. You could just Petrify and Scream, Void Blade, and then Oblivion and next to enemies, and then all of a sudden you do have that full 30% for 5 seconds, instead of running like at least 10, no, it's at least 14% for 10 seconds, you know, and kind of changing over the entire 10 seconds. So it's up to you. Do you want like super fast burst, or do you want to prepare for like a little bit more of a drawn out engagement? Either option's decent, but in my opinion, Baleful Tether works out better when you're running solo and melee. So that's pretty much my build. If you want to see this kind of thing in action, I have my VOD that I said I'll link in the description. You can find me testing all this stuff, see how it really plays out in combat. But again, the basic rotation is whip out the Void Blade first, tether, screech, and then get in there. The reason we pop the sword first is after you apply the Screech with its 2-second root. That 2 or 3 seconds really doesn't last long, so you really want to be taking full advantage of that while it's there, because 15 seconds is a lot longer than 2 or 3 seconds, you know. So the little extra time of casting these 2 abilities while the Void Blade is open really doesn't eat into its uptime that much. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll do my best to answer them. Remember, some of this may change by the time it gets to live, because this is a PTR build, but that's gonna be pretty much it from our experience. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. If you did and you haven't already, make sure you dab on that like, yeet that subscribe button, turn notifications on, and come see me in the support guide, come see me in my streams, come see me in Let's Plays if you're into that kind of thing. I post those every day. And yeah, that's gonna be it for me. Yeet!